Hey guys, thanks for taking the time to check out this video. For today's viewer requested presentation, we're going to be talking about Washington House Bill 1180, specifically how it would affect SKS collectors and enthusiasts both inside and outside of Washington state, as well as why, upon objective analysis, this is a bad faith measure which will strip the rights of law-abiding citizens without delivering on any of the so-called public health benefits which it claims. I personally am not a Washington state resident. However, I know several of you are, and one of you made a pretty compelling case for me to do my best to try to address this subject on the channel. With that in mind, whether or not you are a Washington state resident, I do think that if you are an SKS enthusiast or even just an American gun owner, the content of this video is probably going to be relevant to you. As we all know, there are well-organized, well-funded, and frankly, fairly formidable organizations which are hell-bent on criminalizing your ability to interact with material history, to exercise your constitutionally enshrined rights, and most insidiously of all, to prevent you from passing down your firearm-related knowledge and traditions to future generations. So let's take a look at the language and message of Washington House Bill 1180 and see what we're really up against. So right off the bat, the stated purpose of House Bill 1180 is to increase public safety by prohibiting the manufacture, importation, distribution, selling, and offering for sale of assault weapons. Believe me, we're going to slice this thing apart in just a moment, but first, let's talk about how this would practically affect SKS owners. Bizarrely, page 4 of this bill specifically names the SKS as an assault weapon, subject to the full provisions of this bill. This is unusual because the SKS mechanically is pretty distinct from every other firearm on this list, but it's listed nonetheless. What that means, as best as I can understand from having read the full 15 pages of this bill, is that while current possession of an SKS pattern carbine would, for now, emphasis on for now, because we know how these things go, remain permitted in Washington state, it would be impossible to acquire new rifles, or more specifically, the only means by which someone could legally acquire an SKS is if it was lawfully willed to them by an individual who became deceased, and that individual was able to prove that the previous owner was also a lawful owner in the state of Washington. The state doesn't have to prove that it's not legal, you have to prove that it is legal. That's right, according to this bill, the only way you could give even your own child an SKS is by dying. So very progressive, Washington state. Now, these provisions do not just affect private persons, nor do they affect just Washington state residents. Read that word, importation. Why does importation matter? Well, according to my research, more than 50% of the SKS pattern carbines that have been imported into the United States since we sanctioned the Chinese in the early 90s have come through PW Arms, based out of, you guessed it, Redmond, Washington. Did you buy one of those recent Sino-Banian imports from Bud's Gun Shop, Sportsman's Warehouse, JG Sales, or a few other retailers? Go check your import mark, and I'm pretty sure you're going to find that if Washington state has their way, those imports would not have been able to legally enter the country, regardless of where you happen to live. Don't even get me started on how this might affect Aero Precision, who, in case you don't know, semi-secretly manufactures AR components for a ton of the luxury and high-end AR brands who allege to make all of their own stuff, but visibly don't have the production capabilities to manufacture half of what they claim. Where do those parts come from? A lot of them come from Aero Precision. That's beyond the scope of this video, however. In any case, the point is that this bill would deprive basic rights from SKS collectors like you and me, even if we're not Washington residents, although obviously Washington residents would be by far the most severely impacted because, of course, the biggest threat facing the state of Washington is curio and relic collectors who like to read books about old guns and occasionally shoot them that live in the mountains 1,500 miles away. With all that in mind, I actually, for whatever it's worth, might be willing to compromise on some of my rights if I was convinced that it would significantly protect others. I know that that's not a very popular opinion in most corners of the gun world, but for me, it's actually the truth. My last 3 careers were soldier, security guard, and mental health provider. And I genuinely believe that protecting and serving others is a moral commandment which often requires personal sacrifice. The problem, of course, is that lo and behold, this law, like the 50,000 gun control laws that came before it, isn't actually designed to protect and serve anybody. It's a bad faith proposition which blatantly inverts reality and spits on any semblance of logic and reason. It provides no significant evidence to suggest that the provisions will in any way meaningfully improve public health, and it doesn't even hold up to half-hearted scrutiny. So let's talk about that. Right off the bat, let's examine the core claim of this bill. The legislature finds and declares that gun violence is a threat to the public health and safety of Washingtonians. Okay, I'm with it so far. How do assault weapons fit in? Assault weapons have been used in the deadliest mass shootings in the last decade. An analysis of mass shootings that result in 4 or more deaths found that 85% of those fatalities were caused by an assault weapon. Oh, got it. This all makes sense, assuming, of course, that mass shootings represent a significant percentage of gun violence in Washington. Those need to correlate for this to make any sense. The problem is that they don't, not even close. Even the most rabidly anti-gun organizations in the state of Washington agree that mass shootings are the rarest form of gun violence present in that state, representing 1% of total deaths according to the most generous of estimates. So with that in mind, the stated intent of this bill is to protect Washingtonians from gun violence, and their only proposition to accomplish this is to make it impossible to legally acquire the types of firearms used in some but not all of the rarest type of gun violence present in that state. That funny feeling in your head right now is brain cells dying, by the way. Even if we were to indulge in the fantasy that a gross misdemeanor weapons charge would somehow deter someone from committing capital murder, this entire legislative action is explicitly aimed at combating the least significant facet of gun violence, and yet has the audacity to pose itself as an urgent public health measure. That should already be enough to relegate the 15 pages of this bill to tissue paper, but we're only getting started. Next up, we got a veritable who's who of gun control fallacies, so let's hit them one by one. Assault weapons are civilian versions of weapons created for the military and are designed to kill humans quickly and efficiently. This is a classic one, and it's used really heavily because it sounds really good to people who know nothing about killing and nothing about the military, which is most people. When I was in the U.S. Army, I was trained that there are exactly 3 ways to kill people quickly and efficiently: heavy machine guns, close air support, and artillery. Politicians can argue all day about how this is a weapon of war, but in 2023, that argument is easier to debunk than ever before. I would just ask those politicians, why doesn't Ukraine keep asking for more M4s? After listening to Beto O'Rourke for 10 minutes, I would have thought that all Zelensky needed was a couple crates full of Smith & Wesson M&P Sports in order to bring Russia to their knees. If these are so powerful, then why does Ukraine keep asking for 777s, 242s, Javelins, and Patriot missile systems? The reason, of course, is because this has always been a nonsense bad faith argument. The AR-derived M16 and M4 are objectively 2 of the least powerful weapon systems in the entirety of the U.S. arsenal, and the carbine role, historically and presently, with some exceptions in counterinsurgency operations, but overwhelmingly has been as a personal protective weapon for people who are escorting or operating the heavy weapon systems that actually win wars. Just because something was developed with military applications in mind does not mean that it doesn't have a place in the civilian world. Whether people appreciate it or not, every American home is jam-packed full of everyday appliances which were originally developed for military applications. That's in many ways what it means to be an American. That's how we spend our money. There's no logical reason why a semi-automatic handgun, which was developed for military purposes and continues to be used for military purposes, is totally fine. Meanwhile, a semi-automatic rifle, based on the design of a select-fire rifle developed for military applications, which continues to be used for military applications, is not okay. There's no logic behind that, and my point here is that it wasn't supposed to make sense. It was supposed to resonate between ignorance and emotion. These are bad faith arguments. Next up, the use of the term assault weapon is a common form of narrative manipulation, which is a process in which people who cannot win an argument through logic instead use deception and distortion to make their arguments seem more sound than they are. Like any debate technique which discourages expertise and scrutiny, it's inherently a bad faith practice. The reality is that the term assault weapon doesn't exist, has never existed, and most importantly, has no need to exist. It's a term which was literally invented by the gun control lobby, and its only use is to be indiscriminately and inconsistently applied to any firearm which they want to ban. The etymology of this term is a thinly veiled attempt to confuse constituents by falsely associating so-called assault weapons with the historically defined category of small arms, assault rifles. The problem, of course, is that assault rifles are already subject to extremely stringent federal regulations. In fact, they've never not been subject to extreme federal regulations, and they have enormous functional and mechanical differences from these so-called assault weapons. As a quick piece of evidence that this is exactly what they are doing in this bill, the authors of the bill actually slipped up in the very first page. An assailant with an assault weapon can hurt and kill twice the number of people than an assailant with a handgun or non-assault rifle. I'm sorry, a non-assault rifle? Just going to slip that in there and not define that, while meanwhile using the term assault weapon in every other context? The point here is that they want people to conflate these terms, despite the fact that anyone who's remotely knowledgeable about firearms knows that every Title I firearm is by definition not an assault rifle, and that statement is therefore nonsensical. Of course, people remotely knowledgeable about firearms are not their intended audience. So for everyone else, they want to make it sound like they're banning assault rifles, without disclosing to the reader that Franklin Delano Roosevelt beat them to it by about 90 years. Again, the goal here is to make certain people feel safer, but it's a hollow, rotten promise built on bad faith arguments rather than good faith debate. And people wonder why gun owners are so paranoid. Next. Honestly, can't tell if this one is hilarious or terrifying, but what I can tell you is I've never actually seen this one before in gun control legislation, but I'm not at all surprised. It was Washington that crossed that river first. That was a little Revolutionary War joke for you high speeds, but I digress. Let's read the quote. The legislature finds that the gun industry has specifically marketed these weapons as tactical, hyper-masculine, and military style, in manner that overtly appeals to troubled young men intent on becoming the next mass shooter. Grammatical errors aside, this strikes me as pretty weird. If Minnesota is the land of 10,000 lakes, then Washington must be the land of 10,000 genders. And yet, here we see this idea in law that marketing could be so masculine that it needs to be regulated. Color me confused, Washington, and I know I'm not an expert, but this sure seems a lot like what I think you guys refer to as systemic marginalization based on protected gender identity. So a little confused here. All jokes aside, this is genuinely crazy, utterly divorced from reality. They are suggesting that the Washington gun violence problem is best represented by a literal handful of super mentally unwell mass shooters, while totally ignoring the fact that there are literally Iraq veterans who get more nervous driving through Seattle than they ever did in Fallujah. And the hypocrisy is only just getting started. Many of these Washington-based gun control groups accurately point out that non-white residents are disproportionately affected by firearm homicide, and yet they have no explanation for why this particular law seeks to address the only form of firearm homicide which doesn't follow that trend. It's bizarre. Despite the fact that non-mass shooting related firearm homicide is at least 20 times larger of a health risk for Washingtonians, particularly black male Washingtonians, and despite the fact that Washingtonians are at least 40 times more likely to be killed with a handgun than any type of so-called assault weapon, nope, the solution is going after these guys specifically. Despite the fact that Washingtonians, especially white male Washingtonians, are at least 70 times more likely to shoot themselves intentionally than they are to be shot by any type of assault weapon, again, these are the root of the problem. Of course, there's so much more we could touch on in this dumpster fire of a document, but I can only focus for so long, and I'm going to call it there, guys. I will say I am neither a conspiracy theorist nor am I an idiot, so ultimately I am ill-equipped to put myself in the mind of the people who drafted this bill. All I can say for certain is that even after a superficial analysis, I can say with absolute certainty that this prohibition has nothing to do with preserving the health and well-being of Washingtonians, and its only functional effect will be making criminals out of productive and peaceful citizens. There are no exceptions offered for curio and relic collectors, and there are no pathways established for the vast majority of law-abiding citizens to continue their legitimate pursuits. There is no olive branch included in this bill, and its authors offer only condescension and legal threats to the good people of Washington state. The last few things I'll say before I end this video is that there's a couple of kind of cheeky perspectives I can offer of things I noticed that might be of interest to Washingtonians. I guess it's probably a little late in the video to point out that I'm not a lawyer and this is not legal advice, but on the flip side, if you've been looking at me and listening to me for the past 10 minutes or so thinking this guy's probably a lawyer, well, you're probably going to go to prison anyway, so no harm, no foul. In any case, one of the first things I noticed is that of all these specifically named firearms, many firearms are named in all forms. They make a big point of emphasizing that there are firearms that are specifically named and there are firearms that are named in all forms. Interestingly, the SKS is not. It just says SKS. And the following technical definition does not seem to include the SKS because, again, the SKS is pretty mechanically different from every other firearm on this particular list. So the only part of this document which names the SKS as an assault weapon is just the word SKS. As something of an internet authority on the SKS, I would say that the SKS is a Soviet weapon system that was made in the Soviet Union between 1948 and 1958 approximately. And SKS is actually, according to, it looks like CKC to us, but in Russian it's SKS, and it stands for Samozaryadny Karabin Systemy Simonova, specifically Soviet weapon system. It is true that similarly patterned weapons were manufactured in Yugoslavia, China, Romania, and elsewhere, but it would not be technically or legally accurate to refer to those things as SKSs because they're very proud of not speaking Russian in those countries, and they made significant modifications to the design, and they gave them distinct military designations in their native languages. So do with that what you will. The other thing I'll point out is that while I assume the SKS was added to the list because of its ability to accept garbage tier detachable magazines that are aftermarket products that have nothing to do with the original design of the weapon, I do think it's interesting that certain firearms were not put on that list. So in the tragic event that this bill were to be made into law and Washingtonians were looking for advice on shopping, I might consider things like the M1 Garand, FN49, AG42B Jungmann, Hakim, Rashid, VZ52. That's just food for thought. I'm sure that other people might jump in the comments with other things that you might consider buying. It is tragic because these guns are super cool, but do not think that if you can't get these, you can't get good capabilities, because gun control never works and you have a right to defend yourself. And even within constrictive laws, you can usually find a pretty badass way to stay ahead of the curve. So that's about it, guys. I'm not sure exactly what people wanted me to say, but those are my genuine thoughts on Washington House Bill 1180. It is an affront to common sense and either deeply misguided or truly deceitful attempt to undermine the constitutional rights of peaceful Americans, unconvincingly disguised as a public health initiative. I'm not really a political guy. I'm not proud of that, but that's the truth. So I don't really know how to help other than to bring some awareness and call out lies when I see them. If you happen to know which representatives could or should be contacted in this matter, or you're aware of organizations that are fighting on behalf of gun owners who could use and will effectively use private funds, please put that info in the comments. I will do my best to pin the most helpful comments and add additional helpful information to the description of this video. Other than that, thank you all for watching. Please stay vigilant. Please enjoy these weapons. And if you enjoy content like this, like, subscribe, leave a comment. Not asking for your money, but if I could get 30 seconds of your time to feed the algorithm, I would really appreciate that.